Lesson 2, The Tide of Immigration. Early immigration. The story of Washington's growth is a story of immigrants. They came from many parts of the world, bringing their culture with them. Their many voices and ideas created a diverse society. Sometimes different groups got along. Other times, discrimination or treating people unfairly because of race, age, or gender made life miserable. Some of the first immigrants to Washington were not British or American. They came from Hawaii, Ireland, China, and Japan. Hawaiian Kanakas. Hawaiian men, called Kanakas, had agreed to work for the Hudson's Bay Company for a period of years. They worked as fur trappers, boatmen, cooks, and laborers. After the company moved its fur trade into Canada, many of the Kanakas returned to Hawaii, while some remained in Washington Territory. Some Kanakas married Indian women and blended into the local Indian communities. Irish immigrants. In the 1840s, a terrible disaster hit Ireland, where most people existed on a diet of potatoes. A fungus infected the potato crop, causing them to turn black and shrivel up. Men and women took their starving children and moved away to the promised land of America. Most Irish immigrants settled in the eastern cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, where they usually lived in poverty. However, California's gold rush inspired some Irishmen to move west. When the gold rush failed to make them rich, many left California and headed north to Washington. They settled first in Walla Walla. Many ran for government offices. Some of the Walla Walla Irish moved further north, where they started the first agricultural communities in the Columbian Basin. Other Irish came as laborers on the railroads. The Irish also worked as housemaids, mill hands, miners, or soldiers in the U.S. Army. Chinese laborers. In the mid-1800s, China's government seemed ready to collapse. There was flood, war, and famine. People were desperate to find jobs to provide for their families. Chinese men came to work in the mining camps of the Pacific Northwest. By 1870, there was twice as many Chinese miners in eastern Washington as there were white miners. Chinese men were also hired at low wages to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Both Chinese and Irish laborers were largely responsible for the construction of the first Transcontinental Railroad. Chinese laborers, though, were not given full rights. They could not vote or testify in court cases involving whites. They were paid much less than the white men for doing the same work. They did menial labor, such as washing clothes and cooking. Menial labor is work that is considered to be shameful or humiliating. They also did the most dangerous and most difficult jobs on the railroads and in the mines. Japanese workers. Japanese men and boys also came to find jobs. Here's one story from a boy who came to work on the railroad. He says, "My work was to cut down trees or to dig and fill in land in the mountains. I was only a boy of 15, having just graduated from grade school. When I worked 10 or 12 hours a day, the next morning I couldn't even open my hands. I dipped them in hot water in order to stretch the fingers back to normal, and sometimes I secretly cried. My pay was $1.75 for 10 hours. I had good reason to work my hardest, gritting my teeth, for when I left Japan, I had promised my mother, whose health was not good, that I'd surely come back to Japan in a year." Railroads boost immigration. Besides hiring Irish and Chinese laborers to build the transcontinental railroads, railroad companies sold American land to people overseas. Although their motivation was to earn revenue or income for the railroad, The effect was a flood of immigration. Many immigrants came to the Northwest and Washington in particular. Railroad-sponsored migration was the principal cause of the state's growth after 1880. Railroads hired land agents to sell excess land to businessmen and settlers. Northern Pacific land agents spread out across the United States and the British Isles and Northern Europe. They distributed advertisements for cheap land and job opportunities at weekly farmers markets. Brochures were published in English, French, Swedish, Norwegian, and other languages. Washington's melting pot. By providing incentive, motivation to do something, and a fast way to travel to the Northwest, the railroads were largely responsible for the ethnic mix of the state. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, mostly Canadian, English, German, and Scandinavian immigrants came. People also came from many other countries. By 1910, 46% of Washington's population was either born in another country or their parents were. These new immigrants joined the Chinese and Irish already here. Scandinavian immigrants. Scandinavians were attracted to Puget Sound because its wet climate, high mountains, and many ocean inlets reminded them of home. Norwegians started a settlement at Poulsbo on the Olympic Peninsula because it looked like their native fjord in Norway. A fjord is a long, narrow body of water between steep cliffs. Poulsbo is located just inland of the narrow Liberty Bay, also called Dogfish Bay, in the Puget Sound region. Other Scandinavian immigrants also contributed to Washington's economy by working in key industries. Swedes worked for logging companies, doing work that was familiar to them in their homeland. For example, Carl Hansen and his sons founded the White River Lumber and Shingle Company in Enumclaw. Their company became known for its high-quality finished lumber, which was transported by railroad to every state. Within a decade of opening, the company employed 500 people, eventually becoming one of the largest employers in the region. White River eventually merged with the Weyerhaeuser Company, which was the largest employer in the region. Like Norwegians and Swedes, the Finns and Danes were attracted to industries familiar to them in Finland and Denmark. Finns were drawn to fishing, while Danes were drawn to dairy farming. Poulsbo, Washington's Little Norway. By the 1880s, the number of Norwegians coming to Washington was noticeable. By the early 1900s, more than 7,000 Norwegians lived and worked in the state. They significantly outnumbered other Scandinavian groups. While many Norwegians settled in Seattle, it was the little fishing town on Liberty Bay across the Sound that became known as Little Norway. At least until after World War II, the majority, up to 90%, of Poulsbo residents were Norwegian. They came from nearly every region of Norway except the southern areas near Oslo. Not surprising, Poulsbo residents spoke Norwegian as much, if not more, than they spoke English. Before the Norwegians arrived, Poulsbo was the site of a logging camp and a dogfish oil operation. Dogfish oil was used as a lubricant or grease that helped make the movement of heavy objects easier. The first Norwegian to settle in Poulsbo was Ulla Stubb, whose Norwegian name was Ulla Andersen Stubbhaug. He and his family arrived in 1875 and were joined by fellow countrymen in the late 1880s. These first Norwegians worked as farmers and loggers, and some worked for the railroads. But it was fishing that eventually became the town's major industry. By the turn of the century, there was a large influx of Norwegians from Nordland, an area of Norway near the Arctic Circle. Many had made a living in Norway as fishermen and reindeer herders, a person who raises reindeer. In fact, Some of them came to America to deliver reindeer to Alaska and decided to settle in Poulsbo after delivering the animals. Some of these immigrants became part of a group of men who created the Pacific Coast Codfish Company. The company's processing plant was located in Poulsbo. Company fishermen caught cod off the coast of Alaska. They usually sailed north to the cod banks in April and then returned to Poulsbo in September. Their catch typically netted between 100,000 and 600,000 cod. Workers salted and canned the fish at the Poulsbo plant and sold the finished product under the brand name Icicle. Today, residents of Poulsbo still make a living from fishing, farming, and logging, as well as running small businesses. German farmers. German farmers established small settlements across the Palouse and Big Bend regions. Matthias Reinbold was so impressed by the railroad's message in Germany that he persuaded 9 of his 14 children to emigrate. Emigrate means to leave one's own country and settle in another. Today, their descendants live in Lincoln County. Italians helped build cities. Just as the railroads brought Irish and Chinese immigrants, it also brought Italians to Washington as part of the construction crews. Others came as skilled stonemasons to help rebuild Spokane and Ellensburg and Seattle after the terrible fires of 1889. Italian farmers located in the Walla Walla Valley, where they became famous in later years for their sweet Walla Walla onions. Fire. In 1889, the same year Washington became a state, people living in Seattle, Ellensburg, and Spokane had to deal with the devastation of huge fires. In Seattle, a craftsman was heating glue in his shop when a pan boiled over. When the glue hit the hot stove, it caught fire. Soon, entire blocks of wooden buildings were burning. Flames were jumping from roof to roof and even across dirt streets. By evening, the entire business district was in ruins. Some people were doing business from tents. Italian, Chinese, and other workers helped rebuild the cities, this time with fireproof brick and cement. Anger over immigration. Along with the flood of immigration to Washington and other parts of the United States came reaction from nativists. Nativists were white, Protestant Americans born in the United States who did not like seeing so many immigrants come into our country. In particular, nativists disliked those who looked, spoke, and worshiped differently from them. They were often anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, meaning that they disliked Jews, and anti-Asian. Many nativists held very racist views. Nativists objected to immigration for a number of reasons. One reason was job competition. Nativists feared that they would lose their job to an immigrant willing to work for much less money. Also, some feared that foreigners weakened American culture and values. Their fears were increased by the belief that foreigners would never adopt American culture and customs. Chinese immigrants targeted. One of the first groups to experience this nativist backlash, meaning the reaction, which was usually negative, was the Chinese. Nativists were alarmed that too many Chinese were coming into our country and taking jobs. As a result, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It stopped Chinese laborers from entering the country. A few years later, when many white workers were jobless, they turned their anger against Chinese residents. Violent riots erupted in Issaquah, Tacoma, and Seattle. More than 1,000 Chinese people were expelled from Washington. Their homes and businesses were burned. White residents attacked Chinese men in Walla Walla and Pasco. There's a quote from the Spokane Falls Review newspaper. There is a wash house occupying a prominent position among business houses and hotels. This is not a credit to our town. If Chinese must come, let no man encourage them to locate where their presence will make white residents uncomfortable. Immigration quotas. The anti-immigrant movement came to a head in the early 20th century. At that time, Congress passed laws that sought to count immigration through strict quotas. A quota is a part or percentage of a whole. The quotas restricted immigration based on an immigrant's country of birth. In other words, the laws placed a limit on the number of people who could come to the United States from any one country. The laws placed higher restrictions on immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe than those from Northern and Western Europe. Northern and Western Europeans were not as threatening to the white Americans, since they had similar physical features and were mostly Protestant in their religion. In contrast, Eastern and Southern Europeans had darker skin and practiced Catholicism or Judaism.